Okay, thanks to all of you over on that team for inviting me to this talk and managing all the electronic business. A little background information. I'm an extension associate for commercial small fruits. And I've worked with John Strang on and off actually for almost 30 years. And he retired, supposedly retired this fall, but he's around all the time helping me. So that's wonderful. I did a little bit of counting of the number of blueberry plantings I have visited. And I got back to 2014 and kind of cut it off there. And up to that point, I have been to 41 different farms, ranging from maybe 50 blueberry plants to 12 acres. So that's kind of my, my credential for being able to sit here and tell you what to do with your plants. So I guess you can trust me. We are going to spend a little bit of time talking about the growing site, because that is a big part of where problems start with blueberries and any small fruits. Quite a bit of time about planting and fertilizing. And I'm also going to talk quite a bit about raised beds, because we recommend planting on raised beds. And maybe avoiding some of the planting problems that I see a lot. Okay, these are the people that pay me: Ag Development Fund or Ag Development Board. Underneath them is a Hort Council. So they are doing quite a bit in the state of Kentucky to help you all along. I always start these talks with this slide because so many people have pets, probably more so than children nowadays. And so it kind of helps people. It's a good analogy. You know, our pets, when they need something, they wag their tails or they squawk or rub on your shin, and we respond to that usually right away. And the difference is that with plants, they can't make any noise, so we kind of tend to put off. We kind of tend to neglect certain chores, and that's a big common problem with any of the small fruits. And so I just like to remind people that, you know, these plants need watering and they need grooming in the way of pruning. And, you know, it'd be better to do things within the week than to say, well, I'll get to it 2 or 3 weeks later. So you kind of have to commit to these things if you want them to do well. The biggest things to look at in site selection are the elevation of the planting, slope of the planting. Soil drainage is a pretty big deal, and especially with blueberries, soil pH. So those are the big things to help avoid a lot of the blueberry planting problems. Soil type and fertility, I won't get into quite as much. This is a 7-foot high, probably about a 7-foot wide blueberry hedge. And you can see here that there are quite a few nice big trunks growing down here. These are really big leaves. They are dark green. And this type of plant is by far the exception in what I have seen across Kentucky. And the main reason we are seeing such a wonderful exception here is because of the planting site. This is up on a hill, which you can kind of see. And so it is also on a slope. It is also on some very unusual soil for Kentucky. It is a sandy, almost muck soil. It's kind of what you see in swampy areas like southern Canada or southern Michigan. And blueberries like a well-drained, kind of sandy soil. These plants are just beautiful. Speaking of sand, this is southwest Michigan, down at Benton Harbor area. not terribly far from Lake Michigan, Indiana border. And these are growing on sand. And this is 10 years ago, but I wouldn't be surprised if these plants were still producing and producing commercially since 1955. Again, a well-drained soil. Mind you, these plants are not 50 years old, but their roots are. I put this in here for two reasons. I talked about elevation, and many times when I go to a farm, the best place to plant apples and blueberries and any of our small fruits is going to be on the highest point. And usually what is on the highest point? Well, it's already being occupied by a house. If anybody knows where this house is, it's a trivia question, and please send me a chat. And I guess if you win, I'll buy you a blueberry muffin. That's a beautiful old house. The grounds are really well kept. The house is kind of not. Elevation. Let's go over to the right in this picture. And we're always trying to grow our fruits, and actually probably most of our crops, up high. And the reason for that is because cold air is heavy and cold air drains down to the lowest point. We don't want to be growing blueberries in a low point because there's three reasons here. Let's take the summertime. You go on a farm, you're walking along, you go down to where the creek is, and it's 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and you can feel that air getting colder as you walk down. It might even be mist down in that low area. And that means that low area is staying wetter longer than the higher areas. And that wetness promotes fungal diseases, which are a real challenge for fruit production in Kentucky, including blueberries. Now, in the wintertime, it's also, this low area is again a problem because of that extreme cold. Now, blueberries are pretty tolerant of cold. They can handle 20 to maybe 25 degrees below zero. But still, you don't want a sudden freeze either in the middle of January after a thaw. That can be a problem. So we don't want freeze injury. But then later on, like about this time of the year, your blueberry plants are blooming. They're actually just about ready to bloom in central Kentucky. And then as this weekend coming up, we're looking at 21 degrees Fahrenheit. 21 is cold enough to totally freeze out flower blooms on peaches, apples, trees, pretty much anything. So again, we want to be up in the warmer, higher air so we don't run into so many of those frosts like we're probably going to get Saturday. If you have a high spot, but you got a whole bunch of trees, like a tree line, that can actually block this cold air from flowing down to the lower point. And you can knock out a few trees and actually open up some holes in that solid hedge of trees to let that cold air drain. Slope. We usually say up to about 10% is about as much of a slope as you want to handle, mainly because of the tractor and also because of erosion from rain. And is this example here, this is up in Owenton. This was a little too steep, and we had problems with getting tractors in there to mow or to spray. This was a vineyard. You can see where this fellow is standing, that's flat. Let's just call that the flat ground. And you're going across, and I'm going across horizontally 12 feet over, because this is a 12-foot row spacing. And you can see how far down to this flat ground is. It's about 2.5 feet. So you've got 12 feet divided by 2.5 feet down. That's around a 15% slope. And that was not good. So don't get too slopey when you're planting things. The other thing we recommend, you can plant on a flat surface, that's okay. But if you can plant on a north-facing slope a little bit, or an east-facing slope, it's better. And the reason for that is the north-facing slope doesn't warm up as quickly in the springtime as a south-facing slope. The difference can be as much as 10 days difference. And that means that you're delaying the flower blooms 10 days as well. So that's 10 days, potentially 10 days less that you have to worry about your flower blooms freezing. So you're trying to avoid those spring frosts by planting, if you can, on a north-facing slope. East isn't bad either because the east slope dries out quicker. And again, that helps with those disease problems. Kinds of soils we see, unfortunately, in a lot of Kentucky, we see this kind of gray, heavy clay, or even a yellow clay soil. And those do not drain well. All of our fruit plants, maybe with the exception of grapes, like well-drained soil. And so you want to try to do what you can to break up this clay soil by adding as much organic matter as you can. Or if you're a homeowner, you could add sand, pine needles, wood chips, even garden compost, something to break it up and also to add some organic matter. Yellow clay generally is not good for blueberries. The pH is wrong, and it usually has an awful lot of calcium, and that makes the calcium is not good either. I'll get into that in a second. Nice red soils or dark soils or sandy soils, which do come up now and then, are better for blueberries especially. Blueberries like pH on the acidic side, somewhere around 4.5 to 5.3 or 4.2 to 5.5. It varies with what expert you're asking. And organic matter usually is around 1% in Kentucky. We're looking for up around 5% organic matter. Makes a big difference because that organic matter helps aerate the soil, drain the soil, but also microbes grow in that organic matter, and microbes can help blueberry roots pick up nutrients. It's a special kind of relationship between certain funguses growing in the soil and the roots of the blueberries. The P or phosphorus, the K, which is potassium, and the magnesium, these are all which you can get off a soil test, and the ranges I'm showing here. Those would be on your soil test as well. A lot of times phosphorus is on the low side. Anyway, you want to make sure that your PK and magnesium are all within this range well ahead of when you plant those plants. It's hard to change these levels once you've got plants in the ground. These nutrients slowly percolate into the soil. Calcium needs to be down around 2,800 or less. The reason being that calcium buffers the change in pH. So if you want to try to acidify your soil and you've got a calcium of 4,000, it's going to be almost impossible to drop your pH down to where you want it. Ideally, get your soil tested a year before planting. It's probably not as important if you're a homeowner, but that's what we would recommend. Talking about reducing the pH. Let's say you're up at a pH of 6.2. That's on the high side. It's not going to be good for blueberries. And you want to drop it all the way down to 5.2. That's one whole unit. You can use, the best thing to use is sulfur. On a sandy soil, it's a lot easier because sand doesn't have clay in it. And you only need just under a pound for 100 square feet. 100 square feet is a 4-foot wide blueberry bed that's 25 feet long. So that's within reason of a lot of homeowners. But notice if you've got a clay soil, you've got almost 3 times as, you're gonna need almost 3 times as much sulfur to drop that pH. We've used microfine sulfur, which is a powder, and it'll get all over everything. And get in your eyes, get in your hair. It almost ruined a sweater of mine. It took about 3 washings to get that smell out. There's also flake sulfur, which would be good. Now there are some of what we call prilled or little bead sulfurs. And the beads are made out of gypsum, and gypsum's a calcium product, and we don't want to add extra calcium. So try to avoid buying these prilled or beaded sulfur products. You're spending 10% on calcium you don't need. Organic matter is a big deal. This is the organic matter of choice that the big commercial places use, and it's pine bark that's been ground up. They call it pine bark fines. It's also called composted pine fines or pine bark. And you could also use pine needles. These help a little bit in keeping the pH down, but it's mainly the organic matter we're looking at. Now, it's not cheap. A truckload, a 6-foot bed truckload of that stuff cost me about 75 bucks. Here we're getting ready to make a bed, and we just by hand, we spread some of that out about 1 inch thick and maybe about 18 inches wide. That ended up costing us $50 a foot. But you can get it at some of the bigger garden places. I don't think you'd want to go to Lowe's or the other places I'm not supposed to mention. You'd be paying a lot for the stuff. Let's move on to the actual planting of the berries. We recommend a raised bed of soil for blueberries especially, but also blackberries, strawberries. Actually, a lot of the vegetables we grow are commercially done on raised beds. The main point for that is that, again, that clay soil holds a lot of water for just a little too long, and it causes root rot problems, especially with blueberries. We'd like to see a raised bed of 1 foot high, but that's often impractical. Now, if you're a homeowner, you could probably do that. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. Late fall or early spring are both fine for planting the blueberries. Probably late fall is a little bit better. At this point, if you're thinking about planting blueberries, you're probably not going to be able to find what you want in a nursery anyway. If you want to get certain plants, you need to line those up in August and September with a nursery, and for delivery either in the spring or delivery around, say, November. We planted some blueberries, I think December 1st last fall at the UK farm. The nice thing about the fall is the soil is usually a lot drier. It also gives these plants a time to sit there and settle in and kind of go through their transplant shock when there's not all the sun beating down on them. By spring, they've settled in really well, and the roots have gotten soil compacted against them really well. But a spring planting is okay. You just got to water. Be really careful in water. We always recommend taking a mixture of your soil and 50% peat moss, 50-50 mix of soil and peat moss. And mix that up and plant into that, because the peat holds water well, the peat adds organic matter, and it is acidic. And these plants, unless you're getting them bare root, these plants are going to come basically sitting in a heavy, a high amount of peat and perlite and other things, or maybe pure peat. So those roots are growing in this environment. And if you put peat moss around them, that's something they're used to, and they can go into that relatively easily. We also recommend mulching your blueberry planting, and you can do that simply with things like sawdust, preferably if it's kind of composted and broken down. Wood chips are fine. Straw doesn't hold up really well, but you could use straw or newspaper, cardboard. Landscape fabric from a commercial standpoint is kind of the way they've really been going in the last few years. We also recommend irrigation if you're planting any amount of plants, especially if you're going to be growing them underneath a landscape fabric. Irrigation is important for these plants because blueberry plants don't show you when they're really drying out. They don't get limp. They tend to start showing burning spots in the middle of the leaves or along the leaf margins. And by then, they're pretty stressed. Irrigation also sizes up your fruit. Here's an example of a raised bed. Let's go looking over here on the left where the yellow arrow is. This is flat ground. Here's a young blueberry plant I set in there. And this was a comparison plot. Now you look at this standard issue shovel, that's maybe a 10-inch high spade. So 10 inches up, and this is the top of the raised bed next to it. And there's the blueberry plant on the top of the bed. Now we threw up that bed with some special equipment, 4 years ago, and I can tell you it's about 6 inches high now. So the soil's gonna settle. So get those beds as high as you can realistically get them, unless you're on a super well-drained sandy soil or on a super well-drained sandy soil. We use this giant disking thing. There's a 3-point hitch on the front here. And these discs, you notice that this set of wheel discs is on a bit of an angle, so that these inner discs are actually about 5 inches higher off the ground. Another picture of the machine. You can see it's only about a foot wide in between these discs. And all these other ones are helping to throw soil further in and further in and further in. And even though this is 5.5 feet across, and we ended up with a 18-inch wide bed. This is the machine in action. It takes a pretty strong tractor to pull it, and he's moving pretty quick. Boy, a couple of passes of that and you've got a really high bed. And you can use other cultivating things. Here's another person that didn't have that machine, but basically dug out or used some kind of disking plow to push soil up onto these raised beds. Notice these beds are about 4 feet wide. Notice these beds are not pointy on the top, but they're actually wide across the top, about 2.5 feet wide. I'll get more into that later. Notice the irrigation line. This is a blueberry plant we set at UK. This was a 2-year-old plant. You can see the wooden sticks that we got. There are about 3 or 4 sticks about the height of a set of hand pruners. So that was the before height of this plant. It was dormant when we got it in April. And this is 6 months worth of growth. And that is because they are on a raised bed and because we threw some nitrogen at them, and the soil pH there is 5.1. That's the kind of growth I would like to see. And that's taken quite a bit of experience on John Strang and my behalf, and some help from Oregon to do this. So I'm hoping I can get you people to do this too. So anyway, this is a raised bed, and all we have is wood chip mulch on the top, about 2 inches thick wood chip mulch and a couple of irrigation lines. You don't necessarily need 2 irrigation lines. Now you can also do a raised bed with black plastic covering it, but it is still recommended to put a couple inches of wood chip or even sawdust mulch on the bed before you put the plastic down. And we just had a bucket on a tractor, and we're shoveling out of that to do this. This is an example out of Michigan. This is a single layer of landscape fabric, or what I'm going to from now on call weed mat. It's pretty strong stuff. It can supposedly, some of the new stuff can last 6 years. I'm not sure about that, but I've seen some that's 4 years old that held up. This bed's about 8 inches high. It was formed probably with a vegetable bed layer. It's a firm bed. And again, it's 2 feet wide across the top. You don't want pointy beds. And I promise I will get back to that soon. These people had made a planting hole, probably 8 inches wide, 6 inches wide. And you see they still had to mulch it with wood chips to keep weeds out. You can also see they've used herbicide on the outsides to kill weeds, because those weeds will eventually encroach in here and mess up your landscape fabric. and throw seeds into your planting holes. And weeds in a planting hole are a common problem with blueberries. We were going to use a tube from carpeting. You know, it's about a 6-inch tube of a cardboard tube. And we were going to cut around it with this propane torch. And we decided that that was not very timely. And so we just ended up making an X, cutting through this 6-foot wide landscape fabric. When you do that, don't burn your irrigation line that's right here. So again, this is a single layer of landscape fabric, and that has advantages and disadvantages. This is a 2-piece system. These are, I think, 3 feet wide. No, they're 4 feet wide, because each of these yellow lines is a foot. It's called a zippered system. It's become quite popular out in Oregon and Michigan, probably Georgia. The difference is that you have an opening in the middle of this mulch, opposed to having that solid layer. The advantage with this system is that if you have a leak in your irrigation system, you can just open this up and reach in and fix it. If you're not using irrigation lines, you can open this up and throw your solid fertilizer into the rows instead of just piling up all the fertilizer right around the plant, which isn't going to work after the first couple of growing seasons. And the other thing is you can open up this system and put more mulch down maybe every other year or so, depending on how fast your mulch breaks down. I want to say, why do you want to put mulch down if you're using plastic mulch anyway? And the reason is because this plastic, it can get pretty hot. And the temperature underneath this plastic, it definitely can heat the roots. It helps the plants kind of bloom earlier, we noticed, but it can dry them out quickly. And they've done research to show that. So we're putting this down to help cool the soil, the mulch, the wood chip mulch, to cool the soil, and also to add some more organic matter to the soil over time. We use 8-inch staples on the outside. We stapled this down and then kind of threw some dirt up on it. And then we're using these staples in the middle. You notice that this piece on the left overlaps the piece on the right. This person has to kind of pull this part tight, while John Strang here pulls this side tight, and we anchor it down. Notice we planted the plants. So, goodness. Notice we planted the plants before we put the mat down, as opposed to this other system where we cut a hole and plant into it. Weed mat has been shown to reduce weeding. It can be better than wood chip and sawdust mulch. It does seem to help improve plant establishment, your young plants. Probably maybe a better survival rate. I'm not sure. That was research done out in Oregon. It conserves that mulch underneath it. One thing with mulch, when you have bare mulch on a bed, it breaks down from just a lot of rain. It can get washed down because of erosion, and it can get blown off by wind. The other things, SWD is spotted wing Drosophila. That's that dreaded fruit fly that came out of either Africa or Asia in 2013, and it infects all kinds of small fruits. If you're not familiar with it, you might ask your county agent. It's all over Kentucky, and it's all over the country by now. And it seems like this black plastic helps reduce their population. And the weed mats may improve your bottom line of more fruit, more money. It isn't necessarily true. This is research, again, out of Oregon. This is an 8-year trial, and all I want you to look at is this graph. Up and down side here is the amount of pounds per plant, from 0 to about 5 pounds. Across the right, this is the years from 2008 to 2016, 8 years. You've got two lines here kind of overlapping each other. One is for blueberries with black plastic mulch on them. And one line is for blueberries with sawdust mulch. And one line, there's three lines. And the third line is for wood chip mulch. And you can see, of course, the first year, there was nothing. Well, then in the first yield year, which might have been year 3, they had about 2 pounds per plant. And bottom line is you don't see any real difference between the 3 mulches. And that was for the variety Duke. On the other hand, they did the same experiment with the variety called Liberty, and Liberty yielded 11% better using the black plastic mulch. So the jury is still out depending on what variety you are growing and what part of this country you're using this plastic mulch in. But we're doing an experiment at UK here in Lexington to see how well that mulch does for us in central Kentucky versus those bare wood chip mulch piles that I showed you earlier. The weed mat, on the other hand, I said it does not necessarily help your yield. It does not seem to harm the fruit quality. It doesn't seem to improve it either, at least in Oregon. It does not make your berries come in earlier. It seems to cause them to bloom a little earlier, but they don't seem to harvest earlier. Problems with weed mat is you are going to need to water more frequently. So you're probably going to need irrigation lines because rain doesn't seem to permeate those weed mats very well. Voles love living underneath these weed mats. Voles are little meadow mice, and they like to eat apple roots and they like to eat blueberry roots. They're a common problem. And of course, you have more initial costs with the weed mat and labor to put it down. Irrigation, again, here's a single line. This is sawdust. You can see a very healthy plant there, by the way. You can measure your water status with one of these tensiometers. It has a little gauge here that tells you when you're wet or dry. There's several different wetness gauges. If you're a homeowner, you can probably just dig into your mulch and see if it's moist. If it's moist, you're okay. If it's wet all the time, that's probably not okay. You'd like it to just be evenly, just moist. You don't want to be digging your hand in there and having it be wet. That's wet, and that's not good for blueberries. An inch of water a week is a lot of water, by the way, for if you're planting an acre of plants. A little tip here, when you're using peat moss, peat does not like to take on water, but we want a lot of water in that peat when we're filling up that planting hole, because that water is going to be protecting those roots and helping reduce transplant shock. So you get one of these big, like 20-gallon or 10-gallon buckets, and that's about 1/3 of a bale of peat in there. And I took this hose and ran it to a hot water supply. And I've been to a house that had hot water outside. They were pretty wealthy people, and they washed their car with hot water. That was pretty cool. But anyway, hot water will moisten the stuff. And you want that peat to be so moist that when you grab it and squeeze it, you'll have water running out of your hand. You need moist peat to mix in the planting hole. Other thing that's important, we get our plants, obviously if they're potted, you can't do this, but if you have bare root plants, you soak them at least for a couple hours, if not overnight. Soak them in water so those plants are saturated with water. Again, that's going to help you with transplant shock. It's probably not that important in late November, but we still do that in November. The hole is going to need to be big. I'll show you that. The other thing is you do not put fertilizer in the hole because the roots are tender and they can get burned. That would be a general rule for all small fruits. Well, we'll still be talking about planting a little bit, but I'm going to show you some of the common problems that I see. And we're going to jump a little bit into nutrient deficiency, not too much, but it's important because that does have to do with planting and getting it right getting your young plants off to a good start with proper nutrition. On the left is an example of nitrogen deficiency, and there are three things to show you here. These very small leaves versus these larger ones. So tiny leaves, very short shoots. This is a short shoot here on the right, by the way, too, versus a longer, thicker shoot. The color of green on these leaves is quite pale. Look over here in the very bottom corner. This is a horseweed. That color, that darkness is about what you want on your blueberry leaves. Blueberries are a darkish green, most cultivars. These are deficient. Notice the green also is uniformly deficient, uniformly pale on the leaf. It's not just pale on the outer edges. Uniform paleness separates nitrogen deficiency from, say, potassium or magnesium deficiency. Good nitrogen gives you about 1/8 of an inch thick or even thicker shoots like this with nice big buds for flower production the next year and fruit production. This is a nitrogen-starved little twiggy thing. And look how there's a couple buds there, but they're really small buds. That's not going to give you good fruit production. Another thing, pale leaves again, but also these red dots. Some universities associate these little red, purple dots with nitrogen deficiency, especially when, again, this is a uniform pale green. Now, there are some leaf spot fungus diseases that can cause this as well, but usually when we check these, we don't find disease, so we attribute it to nitrogen deficiency. A common problem I see is that people just don't put down enough fertilizer. In the first year, when you plant these things, you're putting down about 1/2 ounce of actual nitrogen on a plant. And I made a mistake here. Don't read this part on the bottom. That's for mature plants. Anyway, getting back to here, you're going to put 1/2 ounce per plant. If you're using urea, that's 1.4 ounces of urea. Ammonium sulfate, which is kind of what we prefer you to use, that's 3 ounces on a plant, on a young plant. And actually, I would probably cut that in half and add it twice in the year. When you first plant it, maybe a month, 2 months later, add the other half. So a little bit of triple 10, tablespoon of triple 10 or Cleary's in a gallon of water is just not enough nitrogen. The other thing I want to add is that blueberry plants prefer ammonium nitrogen. They don't like the nitrate nitrogen that is in a lot of the homeowner kind of formulations like triple 19 and triple 10. Ammonium phosphate, ammonium sulfate are better for the plants. And urea is ammonia, kind of. On mature plants, again, this is very common. People are just not putting enough down. That planting year works out that 6/10 of an ounce per plant on an acre ends up being about 20 pounds of nitrogen on an acre. Next couple of years, you're still putting around 20 to 30 pounds per acre on those young plants. Notice by the year 6, you've doubled, potentially doubled the amount you need to be putting down. And older plants need a whole bunch of nitrogen. And a lot of growers haven't caught up with that. Iron deficiency is another deficiency, common one. What we're looking at here is the yellowness. And the yellow is only on the tips of the shoots. It's not on the older leaves that are closer to the main branch, just the tips. And that's the key, that it's an iron deficiency and not a potassium or a magnesium deficiency. It's pretty common, and it happens because iron is not readily available to the plant when you get up into the higher pHs, the less acidic pHs. You get into 5.7, 5.9, 6.5, the plant's going to have a hard time picking up nitrogen. And if that's the case, you're going to need to supplement that iron either by using some chelated products like Osmocote which you can get at the big box stores or any garden supply store. Scott's Top Dress, which is cheaper. I shouldn't tell you that. And there's some other formulations available, but these have chelated iron and some other things, copper and stuff, that can move into the soil when the soil's a high pH. So if you've already planted your plants and you've got that clay soil and it's a 6 pH, you may need to be using this stuff every year. And notice we're putting down on our mature plants 2 ounces every month for 6 months. That's a lot. That's to get all the nitrogen down. But they don't reduce the pH as good as, say, putting sulfur down would do. And you can put sulfur on the surface of the soil, but it's going to take a while for that sulfur to get down to where the roots are and change your pH. Now then we're moving on. That's all I'm going to talk about with nutrient deficiencies. Those are the common ones. Here's some problems that result, again, from planting mistakes. This plant on the left, I pulled it up, and you can see on the bottom, there are no new roots. There's just these dark brown, dead, and black roots. You can kind of see this soil is wet, it's saturated. You can also see that it's almost all peat moss. So what it is it's the plant ball that came from the nursery. And I suspect what this grower did is they set that plant into a hole, and that plant hit the bottom hard pan of clay, and those roots could not go down. The roots will go out, but they will not go down. And the problem with that is now you've got roots growing outward into maybe the softer soil, but they're very shallow, and now they are at risk of drying out. So again, irrigating regularly becomes very important. We'd like to see these roots go down more than they go out. So the remedy for that is to have a large planting hole, 12 inches deep, 12 inches wide. Your plant isn't going to fill that hole. And in fact, you're going to need to backfill that hole up about 5 inches with your peat and soil just to get the plant high enough to the proper planting height. But that's what you need to do to give that plant, that baby, a nice environment on all sides and the bottom to grow into. And this plant on the right, notice again this gray clay. It's not great for growing in. And I see these roots that were just kind of all tangled together and wrapped around each other. And what I suspect happened is this plant came in a container and the plant was root bound. And those roots, when you take a plant out of a pot and it's all root bound and the plant and the roots are going around in a circle, they're not going to stop going around in a circle unless you break up those roots and pull them out and loosen them up. So that's what happened with this plant. Not to mention that it's in really nasty clay. So this is what I mean by root bound, and this is a mild example. But even here, you could take your fingers and just break this up a little bit. Don't worry about breaking some of the roots, but just kind of break this root ball up and let those roots kind of spread out into that planting hole. Another common problem is putting a plant in the ground and having the mulch be too deep. This is 5 inches on a ruler up to this red line. The bottom of this ruler is on the ground. Obviously, this has been pulled out of the ground, but anyway, this was the height of the plant where it was growing in the ground. We recommend you when you plant blueberries and just about everything else that you can grow a small fruit, you want that plant to be set at the same depth that it was growing in the pot that you receive it in. You don't want to set it where it's shallow and the planting ball is above ground, because then the roots dry out. And you don't want that soil to be more than maybe a half inch at the most high up onto the sticks, the twigs of the plant. You pretty much want it tamped down and nice and firm and planted as it was in the nursery. In this case, it was probably planted in okay depth, but the mulch was 5 inches deep. And either way, if the soil is too deep and or the mulch is too deep on a blueberry plant, the bark starts to get wet and the bark rots and falls off. And then the plant no longer has the vascular system of the plant, that green stuff that's just underneath the bark. That vascular system rots. And now there's no way to get water up to the top of the plant. And that's a common problem with blueberries. So this mulch is like 3 inches too deep and it holds the water in, and that's no good. This one was just plain old planted too deep. Again, this is about the level of the planting depth, the root ball, and either they just threw a bunch of dirt on it or the plant maybe just sank into the hole all the way up to here and it just died. That it was just plain old, you can just peel the bark off the trunk with your finger. And again, if you had set this into a hole and tamped down the soil and peat mix under that hole, under this plant ball, the plant would be less likely to sink down. Now, the other thing I noticed is this is sod out here, and the people just took a shovel and dug a hole. And back here too, you can see there's no bed. They just dug holes and set blueberries into the soil, into the sod. That doesn't work. So please don't do that. The grass is just too good of a competitor for nutrient and water. And these plants won't be able to tolerate that. So again, talking about planting things too deep or the plant sinking. The pencil points to the base, where the base of the root ball. And just that red here, that's where there's no bark. The bark just all sloughed off and this thing died. So what you can do to let that not happen, make a raised bed and firm up and flatten the top of that bed. Get that soil at least a little bit firmer. And again, tamp down that soil inside that planting hole and set that plant to the height so that the top of your bed and the top of that plant are the same height, and fill it in. If after a while, if after 2 or 3 months you go back and you see that you've got a bowl with a plant sunk into it, either try to take some of that raised bed away from it to allow water to drain, or maybe even just lift up that plant and pull it up and tamp it back down again. You may risk damaging some roots, but if you leave it in that sunk in that dirt, it's probably going to die anyway. Okay, so that's important. Look at those plants 5 or 6 months after you set them and see how they're doing as far as planting depth. The mulch, let me back up here. The mulch can be, outside away from the plant. You can have 4 to 6 inches deep mulch, but right at the plant, you don't want more than about an inch deep mulch. And that's true with maple trees and whatever you've got in your front lawn as well. You don't want these volcanoes of mulch around a maple tree or an apple tree, because again, the bark just sloughs off and it kills the plant. You really want a mulch, a donut mulch, with the middle being the shallow point. And I gotta hurry along. The black fabric will burn these tender new shoots. So you have to put wood chips around here to help prevent the black fabric from burning your brand new plants. We learned that the hard way. So an inch or so of something on top of here to protect the plant, the brand new plant. This is a bed that you can see the mulch is just blown away over time. You can also see the plant used to be in the soil, and this root over 4 years, this root is nice and big, but look at that. You can put this pencil right through. You can see some peat moss right on the side. So again, the bed has eroded away from rain, or is just soft soil. Look at here again, the plant obviously hit a hard pan and stopped sinking but the soil around it kept sinking away. And so now the top of the root ball is exposed. And that exposed root ball wicks up moisture, and then the moisture evaporates. And again, your wood chips have all eroded and blown away. Too narrow of a top of the bed. I kept telling you I'd get to this slide. If your bed's really narrow on top, look what happens. This is only about 8 inches from the center of this plant to the edge of this bed, and the rain has washed away a lot of the top of this bed. And what happens? The roots on the side of this plant are exposed to the air. So again, try to have a 2-foot wide bed on the top and keep it covered with mulch so that if there's any roots on the side of that bed, they're not exposed to the air. Meadow mice or voles. This is a nice blueberry plant, and we've dug away on the side, and you can see this big old tunnel where the voles run. Voles are not moles. Moles are the ones that make those soft mounds in your grass, and moles are carnivorous. Voles are eating seeds and roots, and they're tiny little mice. But they'll get under a plant and chew those roots down. And I can see a perfectly nice plant. Look at those nice sized leaves and the color. That's a nice color. This plant is dead, and what I'll do is first thing I do is I'll grab that plant and shake it and see if it's a loose tooth. And a lot of times it's because voles have chewed the roots away. These above ground trackways, above ground sort of tunnels, that's what the voles make. So that's what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, this is another environment, I said. This plastic, they like to live under it in the winter, but look at these weeds and look at all this thatch from mowing the lawn. They love this stuff. They love thatch and they love weeds. So this is ground zero for voles, and they were there. You can make one of these out of 1.5 inch PVC. You really don't need this T on the end. You can take an 8-inch piece of PVC, get a what's called a test cap from the hardware store that you put in on the end. Don't use masking tape because animals will chew through it. You take your poison bait, you put it inside here. The bait's in the bottom. The vole goes in and eats it. Notice this side of this tube is a little bit higher than this side. That means the rain won't get in there and turn this stuff soggy. From zinc phosphide is what's used in gopher bait and some of the rat poisons and stuff. From a commercial standpoint, that is not legal. The only legal thing you can use is Prozac bait pellets, and that's kind of unfortunate. Otherwise, keep your weeds down, and you may think about taking up that black plastic mulch during the winter. Electric deer fence. This is electric, but I'm not so sure you even necessarily need electric. The problem for deer is they can jump an 8-foot fence, but they cannot negotiate this 2-foot fence plus this 4-foot fence. And these are about 4 feet apart, 5 feet apart. They have a hard time figuring that out. Just like supposedly, and this is a great story, a lion tamer uses a chair because, and I've been told this, the lion cannot figure out the stool, the 4 legs of the stool. It baffles the lion. Isn't that a cool story? Well, this baffles deer. So that's as far as I've got to go. The Midwest Blueberry Production Guide is available online at that website, or just type in Midwest Blueberry Production Guide. You can get to that through the UK Horticulture site. That would be a good way to get started. And there's the people, there's my name. There's a commercial Hort site. Dan Becker in Western Kentucky is fully qualified to tell you all about this stuff, as is Sean in Eastern Kentucky. He's over in Quicksand. Dan is in Princeton.